This is the conversation with Samuel Freedman. He's an author, columnist, and professor of journalism at Columbia University. He's a former columnist at the New York Times and the author of 10 acclaimed books, including The Inheritance, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1997, and his most recent book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert, Humphrey, and the Fight for Civil Rights. In this conversation, we discuss his journey getting into journalism, the power of journalism and news and language. We talk about the current political landscape. We discuss Hubert Humphrey, the civil rights movement, the use of violence against non-violence in mass movements, and the psychology of power. This is No Time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project runs on your love and support, so if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon or Anchor, or you could subscribe or leave a gift on Instagram. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For the forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. Well, now, American people, it's No Time. In the year 1968, when you were 12 years old, you got the first job of your life as a paperboy for the New Brunswick, New Jersey Home News. That was your first rendezvous with journalism, and for over 50 years since that day, you haven't looked back. You have often described journalism as doing God's work. So let's start with that. Why do you think journalism is doing God's work? And was that self-evident? Was that obvious to you from your first job from the age of 12 itself?
I don't know if I thought about it in that profound way at the start, but I grew up really immersed in journalism even before I became a newspaper delivery boy. Both of my parents were ardent newspaper readers. My mother's desire for her life would have been to be a journalist or a writer of some kind, but for a variety of reasons, primarily needing to help her family during the Depression, she ended up having to work in more practical ways and then died quite young. But she and my father got multiple newspapers at home. And I think it was actually when there was a newspaper strike in New York City in 1964, so when I was 8 or 9 years old, the sudden absence of our daily delivery of the New York Times had a big effect on me because I realized if my parents missed it so much, there must be something pretty amazing here. And that's when I remember starting to become a newspaper reader, was when the strike got settled and it resumed. And also in our home, the kids were encouraged to talk about current events at the dinner table. So everything that was going on in the mid-'60s would have been very much the civil rights movement, which of course has been something I've returned to a lot in my writing as a grown-up. And then the Vietnam War and presidential races. So I think all of that also deepened my sense of attraction to journalism. And then there was something really meaningful about being a paper boy. There were paper girls too. I don't want to gender it, because I saw how much people were relying on me to get the paper to them every day. People, some of them would wait on the porch. It was an afternoon newspaper, so after school, I'd go and pick up my 60 or 70 newspapers and wrap each one in a rubber band and put it in a canvas sack and start walking through my hometown of Highland Park, New Jersey. And so many epic and very tragic things happened during the year I was a paperboy. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson said he wasn't going to run for president again. And so it felt like I was not just delivering this, product to people, but I was giving them something that was very essential for how they were living their lives. Yeah. And that always stayed with me.
Can we explore that? What a year to start as a paperboy, 1968. Let's stay in that year. You mentioned it on a rainy afternoon in April when you on your paper route, you had a bulletin on the radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. A few months later, your mother came to wake you up early in the morning, tell you that they had shot Bobby Kennedy. On that evening, when you went to the house of this immigrant family from Honduras to deliver the paper, one of them said, "How can you publish a paper on a day like this?" You have lived through these events, you have seen them, you have felt the emotion on these days. For me, it's just a history lesson. Mm-hmm. I can only read about it, but it's lacking a certain amount of depth or dimension to it because I wasn't there. How much of a difference how much of a difference does it make in your writing? Have you noticed that when you write about historical events that were before your time in comparison to the events that you've actually lived through, have you noticed that it gives you an additional layer, a certain amount of depth to it? Or do you think you've now reached a level of mastery where you can convey both type of historical events in the same tone?
That's a really terrific question, Shalaj. What I've learned actually over many years is that the place where you're inclined to cut a corner or to make a mistake is with something you think you know. Yeah. That you're actually a lot more careful as a journalist or as an author when you're researching things that you haven't lived through. If you think you know something, if you recall having lived through something, you're likely to over-rely or over-trust your own memory and your own analysis. In one respect, it's helpful because when I would interview people about things that I lived through myself, I would sometimes have a more personal kind of question to throw into an interview because, as you were recounting from my book for young journalists, there was that moment that I never forgot about the family so stricken by Bobby Kennedy's assassination, asking me, how can they even publish the paper today? So if I was interviewing someone about that period of time, I might draw on my own experience in a question, or that moment when I was in the car with my mother and we heard the bulletin about Dr. King being killed. But it's very important not to extrapolate or to generalize from your own experience and to be open to the fact that my memory, just like anybody's memory, is really fallible and really subjective. And it's not that it's a matter of being mendacious and deliberately lying. I've interviewed very, very few people, especially for the books I've written, who I think ever with any intent were telling me falsehoods. But memory gets fuzzy. And so you have to constantly be cross-referencing contemporaneous documents or newspaper accounts or people's diaries or letters or period photographs or whatever it is in order to make sure that the memory they have, however sincerely held it is, corresponds to what actually did happen.
Yeah. Was this a gradual realization, or was it like one story that drew this epiphany out of you that, yes, maybe my memory might not be the best source of
I think it happens over a period of time. I think that over the years when I've had corrections run, like when I was doing for 10 years a column on religion for the New York Times, and it was deeply into the online publishing era then. And so at that point, if anything was factually incorrect or if people thought it was incorrect, even if sometimes I was correct, they'd be able to email the person who was called the standards editor at the New York Times right away and ask for a correction, which if I had erred would have to be given. And it struck me over and over and over again that in the times when I would need to have a correction done, it would not be because I'd researched something poorly or made a note that was incorrect. It was so often because I was so sure I knew something already that I didn't fact check it adequately myself. So I had to actually really change my own journalistic practice at that point and realize that the things I think I know are exactly the things that I'm most likely to probably slip up on. And in terms of what you think you know that you may not remember correctly, the way I put it to my journalism students at Columbia is I say it's like eyesight. There are two things that make an image blurry. One is being too far away, but the other is being too close. And that closeness, I think, has struck me over a few stories over the years. I think one of the first times I was really aware of it was when I was a baby reporter on the New York Times in the 1980s, my first of several different stints on the paper. I did a story about a reunion of the people who'd grown up in an anarchist colony that included my father's family. And Rutgers University in New Jersey had their archive, and once a year, all the people who'd grown up there would come together. And I did an article about it, and I was really dissatisfied with the article. And it ran, I just thought, I really didn't get this right. I really didn't convey the intensity of this experience and the intensity of the reunion. And I realized that it was the difficulty in writing about an experience that I already knew a fair amount about, that I couldn't put myself in the head of a reader who knew nothing.
Yeah.
Because that's another thing I often talk about with my students is you have to go through three processes, particularly in writing a book. I say knowing, unknowing, and re-knowing. So knowing is doing the research. Unknowing is putting yourself in the head of the reader who hasn't done the research. Re-knowing is conveying what you've learned to a reader as if that reader, or conveying what you've learned to a reader who knows nothing. So it's almost like you're retelling what you have found out to yourself, but through yourself to the reader.
Gotcha. Yeah. Did you build that over experience and intuition, or does it come more naturally to some people? They can just do it immediately, or do you think this happens over time?
In journalism or book writing, as in anything else, so-called natural ability is the most overrated human trait in the history of humanity. And what you learn is that you can't just depend on whatever your reflexes are or whatever you might intuit, that you have to keep on building your skill set and really, ardently expanding and deepening your craft and using that. Look, I think that there are certain personality traits that are probably common to certain types of writers. And I think for those of us who like to do long form writing, whether in, newspaper, magazine, or in my case, books, that's really centered on individuals, or as they call it in the publishing industry, character-driven narrative, we're endlessly curious about the human condition. And I think that's something that can't be taught. Either you're curious or you aren't. And I don't think you can learn how to be curious. If you have curiosity, you can learn ways to use it. You can be curious, but also be shy, and you can learn techniques to get over your shyness. One of which is just to tell yourself, I'm a professional author or journalist, so I have this kind of metaphorical card that allows me to not be shy as I would be in my private life. But the curiosity, that's just in you or not in you.
Yeah, you're throwing so many nuggets that I want to explore further, but we have to stay on track. Otherwise, we're going to be here the entire
I'm sorry
day.
to take you off on my own little tangents.
It's so fascinating, and I just want to explore every single idea about curiosity as well. But let's stay with the structure for now. We were talking about the events that you have witnessed and how that changes your writing. And then we took this digression. Very beautiful. Let's bring it back. Let's talk about some events that we've both witnessed now. In the recent years, they have been pretty chaotic, pretty polarizing. We've witnessed extremely contentious presidential elections, 2016, 2020. We've witnessed the January 6th insurrection, George Floyd protests, war in Ukraine, the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Many people often loosely throw around the phrase, this is the worst it's ever been. This is the most troubling time in human history. We spoke about all these historical events you've lived through. Of course, your parents have also lived through World War II, the Holocaust as well.
Exactly.
I think you're the perfect person to ask this question. Is this really the worst period in human history, or do you think we're still relatively much better off?
Well, I can't speak of human history because I can't go back to the period of the bubonic plague or the barbarian sacking the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages. So I can't draw that comparison. And I think that there is a tendency to privilege what's happening now and feel like because we're living through it now, this must be the worst. And in some ways, it is a more dire moment than any I've lived through. And I'll get to that in a second. But as you said, my parents both grew up in the Great Depression, and particularly in my mother's family, they were really living hand to mouth. When I wrote a book about my mother, I found out that my grandmother, when her husband, my grandfather, was out of work for months and months and months at a time, would literally go and pick garbage to, get sort of spoiled food or partly spoiled food out of garbage cans to make sure the family got fed. The 68, the year we were talking about before, the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the police riot against anti-war protesters and journalists at the 68 Democratic Convention. That was a year when it did feel like things were really in some ways spinning, out of orbit for this country. And, for my kids who are now respectively in their late 20s and early 30s, their coming of age was the September 11th attack, living at a time of rising Islamophobia and hate crimes against innocent, minority communities in this country, the Great Recession. So that was some of what affected them. But I do think that what's really different, and I especially experienced this as a nonfiction writer, about the Trump era is the war on truth itself, the war on factuality itself. When I think back of the Vietnam War years and the turmoil in the country, or I think of the Watergate scandal under Richard Nixon, because the news industry was a lot more concentrated than 3 major TV networks, a few major national magazines like Time and Life that would circulate 20 million copies apiece, major not only national newspapers like the New York Times, but big influential regional newspapers like the Chicago Tribune or the Louisville Courier-Journal. I didn't have the sense then that there were different vying versions of truth out there. I understood that there were different analyses and interpretations of what the facts were, but I didn't feel then, in a way I do unfortunately feel now, that there are actually 2 versions of what reality is, one of which is real reality, and one of which is a dangerously manufactured false reality, which is nonetheless clung to by a large number of people in this country. And there's a famous line from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a longtime senator from New York and a great public intellectual, who said, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but nobody's entitled to their own facts. But that's been proven false in the Trump era. There's the sense that you can invent your own facts, and they're as good as what objective, provable, demonstrable reality is. And so in that respect, it's a much more dangerous time than any that I've lived through. I remember how much being in college, in particular a very left-wing campus at the University of Wisconsin in the Nixon years and Watergate years, the utter contempt we all had for Nixon. But I don't think anyone thought for a moment that Nixon was going to turn the country into a dictatorship, even at his worst. And that's a very real risk with Trump. And of course, the attitude about journalists from then till now is like polar opposites. When I was taking journalism classes in college in the mid-'70s, if anything, there was too romantic a view of journalists because Woodward and Bernstein and all the president's men, and my journalism classes were filled with people who thought, wow, I'm going to get famous and be a hero is to become a journalist. And of course, people like that didn't stay with it. But now it's 180 degrees different. And people who become journalists, my students at Columbia, who work in this country, I'm not talking about going to be a journalist in a dangerous place like in the cartel-controlled areas of Mexico or in Russia. I'm talking about in the U.S., they have to think about, will I be physically attacked? Yeah. Will I be doxxed? Just how do I get reality through to people who don't want to receive it in the form of my article or my broadcast? And so that's what's definitely more treacherous than anything in my 67-year and 10-month lifetime.
Such a fascinating dynamic that when you had this monopoly of a few agencies that were providing the news, they upheld this sense of integrity and they delivered the news. But now that you have this oversaturation of agencies and outlets, suddenly there's so many versions of the truth. It's very different from what you have thought.
Right. Well, I don't want to simplify it because I think it cuts both ways. Because those news and I should have said this before, so I'm glad you came back to this. The news organizations at that time, and the ones I started out my career on in the 70s, were almost entirely white male. If there might be one person of color on a staff of 40 or 50 people. Anyone who was gay was closeted. The women who were on the paper were often stuck in, quote, traditional women's news, like writing about social events or food. And not that there's anything wrong with those beats, but they were not encouraged to cover politics and to cover medicine and, to cover international affairs. So that was a very limited view of the world. And there are a great many positives that have come out of the internet era in journalism, a democratization of who can do journalism, way, way greater diversity in news organizations. And I don't mean just the little startups, but the way a newsroom at the New York Times or the Washington Post or CBS News or CNN or NPR looks now in terms of its demographics versus 25 or 35 or 40 years ago, that's a gigantic improvement. But when anyone can jump into the game, when anyone can start a website, when the barriers to entry are so low, it also means it's easier for demagogues to get in. It's easier for even well-intended amateurs who have no standards to get in. And you get a situation like we have with Fox News, which has evolved from a definitely right of center, but, pretty much legitimate news organization when it was founded in 96 to basically a political movement that's masquerading as a news organization now. And because they can have a TV channel or a website like any other legitimate news organization, it looks like there isn't, a significant difference between Fox News and, let's say, CNN or NPR. And there's actually a gigantic, immense difference.
You have often said that there's a repeating cycle in American history, which starts with oppression, resistance, emancipation, progress, backlash.
Yes.
What stage of that cycle are we in now, and what's next?
Well, we're definitely in backlash.
Okay.
And just to give you a sense of the kind of bigger historical trajectory, for me, this starts with enslavement, the resistance of the abolitionists and the revolts of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and other enslaved people, and then the Civil War and the emancipation, literal emancipation, and then progress in the form of Reconstruction and the enfranchisement of Black male voters in the South, and then the backlash, the overthrow by white terrorism of Reconstruction. Then you come forward, and at the era of mass immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, when Jews and Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were not really considered white at that time, came in large numbers to this country, people like my grandparents. And then there's the backlash of nativism and eugenics and shutting down immigration and closing what was called the Golden Door. And then the civil rights movement is, an act of resistance against the Jim Crow system, emancipation in the form of new laws that are being passed and Supreme Court decisions, progress, and then the backlash, what was called massive resistance, which includes the assassination of Dr. King and the dynamiting of churches and the murders of other civil rights activists. And it, unfortunately, is no surprise with that historical cycle in mind that after 2 terms of Barack Obama as president, and after the Supreme Court enshrines the constitutional right to marriage equality, and after this, to my mind, wonderful period of post-1965 immigration from all kinds of parts of the world, whether, it's from, South Asia, the Middle East, the Caribbean Basin, Asia, you name it, that all that almost inevitably has led to the Trumpist backlash, which is what we're in right now. And I had hoped that the 2020 election was going to be the end of that. But of course, there was a coup that barely failed, but fortunately did fail. But once the Republicans all coalesced around Donald Trump again, and his base has so adopted the nativism and the resentments and, this really toxic version of nationalism, that it's clear that 2024 is going to also be an immensely important and I think even maybe more than 2020 dispositive election for whether we can beat this backlash down or not.
Does it lead to oppression again?
Well, that I hope that there would be a period of some progress. Again, it's slightly, you're right, it slightly staggers the sequence of of the elements in my cycle, but I think that it will repeat itself once more. in my book about Hubert Humphrey, and I know we'll talk about this later, I write about a couple of people who really influenced him, one of whom was a black newspaper publisher. Another one was a Jewish lawyer who was sort of a one-man anti-defamation league in Minneapolis in the 30s and 40s. And his daughter is in her 80s and still alive. And I asked her, and this is actually in the epilogue of the book, what it was like for her to watch the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville with all the chants of, Jews will not replace us and so on. And she said she was shocked, but she was not surprised because her father would always say to her of the bigots and the haters, they don't go away, they just hide.
Let's talk about it. You brought it up. We were in the year 1968. We took some wonderful digressions. Let's get into a time capsule. Let's go even further back. Let's go into 1948. Can you paint the picture? It's a few months before the Democratic National Convention. What was daily life like for a Black American at that time? What type of Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, racism was an average African American living at that time subjected to?
That's a really important question. Well, you first would start by dividing the country between the southern states, which actually had essentially legalized apartheid, which was enforced by terrorism when necessary. But if you're talking about the South, you're talking about Black people being either out of terrorism or these ridiculous bureaucratic rules designed to frustrate them, being virtually unable to vote or even to register to vote. So in states where Blacks might be 1/3 or 1/2 of the population, a tiny fraction of them will even dare to vote. In terms of occupations, they're telescoped basically into two lines of work. The women into domestic work, housekeepers, childcare, etc., cooks, and the men into either agricultural labor or male versions of service jobs, being someone's butler if they're a wealthy family or someone's chauffeur. And it's rare at that point for Black people to be able to even graduate from high school. A tiny percentage, less than 10%, will get a college degree. And so that's in the South, but the North has its own set of problems at the same time because the North may not have a legal structure of American apartheid, but it has many of the customs of it. And so a Black person could vote in the North. A Black person would find it easier or less difficult to buy a piece of property and own a home, but where you could work was limited. Where you could live was limited. You had, particularly heading into 1948, a situation in which in the job market, and I'm talking about in the North now, not the South, not only did management have bias against Blacks applying for jobs, but many labor unions were incredibly racist as well. So Black workers were sort of left with no real avenue of upward mobility. And the other thing that makes the situation in the late 40s really significant is this. When the United States joined World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a movement among Black GIs, and it was amplified by the great Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, that, okay, we know this country treats us at best as second-class citizens, in some cases as barely as human beings, but we're going to go and fight for this country against fascism with its own forms of Aryan supremacy. But then we're going to come back and leverage our sacrifice and demand our equal rights. And we're going to take on the versions of fascism on the home front. And that movement had a great slogan. It was called Double V, for double victory. And what happened with the end of the war is that double victory was not achieved. In fact, it was another one of these backlashes because we had Black veterans come home, and particularly in the South, the sight of a Black man in a U.S. military uniform, and especially if that Black person would then try to go in the front door of the restaurant instead of the back, or refused to go to the back of the bus or register to vote led to a series of unspeakably vile attacks on these veterans that really attested to how much work was ahead for America in delivering to its own citizens what it had delivered to the people of Western Europe and Asian countries like China and Korea in defeating the Nazi Germans and the Imperial Japanese. And so that was kind of the racial landscape, at least for Black American at that time.
So that was the racial landscape around 1948, almost 6 years before the recognized, in quotes, inception points of the civil rights movement. But in your book, Into the Bright Sunshine, you make the case that many people often mistakenly believe that Brown v. Board of Education or Rosa Parks and the bus boycotts were the starting points of the civil rights movement. There was this one event that happened almost 6 years prior to that at the Democratic National Convention of 1948, which set the civil rights movement in motion. So let's shed some light there. Who was Hubert Humphrey and what role did he play in the civil rights movement?
Right. Well, Hubert Humphrey, as maybe some of your viewers know, later became a longtime U.S. Senator. He was the vice president with Lyndon Johnson. But they also, if they remember anything about him, remember or are aware of the kind of the conventional view of him, which has come down over the years, which is that he had betrayed liberalism by supporting the Vietnam War. Yeah. He ran too many times futilely for president, and even by one of the last races when he was running for the Democratic nomination in 1972 against George McGovern, looked like this. It was this figure who was an object of ridicule. He's frenetic and desperate, and so he's remembered, if at all, with this mixture of scorn and pity. And yet there was this earlier version or a part of Humphrey who people may not know at all, who was this incredibly bold leader on civil rights. And keep in mind, he also did astonishing work on behalf of civil rights as Lyndon Johnson's vice president and in the Senate as well. But all really begins in the 1940s and hits a crescendo at the 1948 Democratic Convention. And what's remarkable is that people, again, think of Humphrey as sort of this career politician because he had like 3-decade career in public life before his death in 1978. But at the 1948 Democratic Convention, he's a kid, politically speaking. He's 37 years old. He's the mayor of a mid-sized city, Minneapolis. It's the only elected office he's ever held. He's only had it for 3 years. And yet he becomes one of the leading civil rights figures in the United States at that moment because of a battle, which we'll talk about, I know, over what the Democratic Party's stance should be on civil rights. And he's part of a cohort of people, Black and white alike, who are essential to this underappreciated civil rights movement of the 1940s. It's, you have people like A. Philip Randolph, who was a great Black labor leader and civil rights leader, and Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, who were just in different and complementary ways waging this incredible battle on behalf of racial equality all through the 1940s, and a battle, and this goes somewhat to the point I was making about Double V before, a battle for civil rights that's inextricably bound up with the experience of the global war against fascism in World War II.
You mentioned the battle within the party. What type of risk was Humphrey taking when he said, we need to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights? What was the general sentiment around segregation and civil rights within his own political party? Was he hurting his chances in politics, maybe even putting his life in danger?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to start by peeling away everything from the way politics looks like in America now. Okay. So when we look at contemporary politics, we think of the Democratic Party, whatever its flaws, as essentially being a coalition that's an interfaith, interracial, straight and gay, immigrant and native-born coalition united by ideas on behalf of an inclusive democracy. And we associate the Republican Party very much with white supremacy. It would be impossible to officially go back to an apartheid Jim Crow system, but that idea that being a white Christian is the only legitimate way to be American is very much what we think of in the Trump era, the Republican Party being about. Well, let's go back to 1948, and it's very different, certainly within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at that time is still the coalition that Franklin Roosevelt put together, the so-called New Deal coalition. And it's a really weird contraption because the New Deal coalition has some of the expected components that a liberal coalition would have. It has labor unions, it has urban Jews and Catholics who are immigrants or the children of immigrants, it has college-educated intellectuals, it has some of the black vote, although a lot of the black vote still goes to Republicans in homage to Abraham Lincoln and emancipation in the Civil War. But then the Democratic New Deal coalition has this bizarre other element, which is the segregationist wing of the party. And at this time, the Democratic Party basically has a one-party rule over the entire South. It is the party of Jim Crow. It is the party of white supremacy. And Franklin Roosevelt had made what I think of as almost literally a devil's bargain with that wing of the party, because he felt that he could not win election without the electoral votes from the Deep South. He could not get his New Deal programs through Congress without the political support of very senior and powerful Southerners who were in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the deal he essentially made with them is some New Deal programs, even Social Security, will be written in a way to omit many black workers because they'll omit domestic workers and agricultural workers. Virtually all New Deal programs will be implemented locally by the states, which means in these southern states, they're implemented in a racially discriminatory way. And when it came to what the party's official stand and its platform was about civil rights, the language would always be very fuzzy and vague and equivocal, so that the southern wing of the party could say this permits us what they called states' rights. States' rights was their euphemism that if the Constitution doesn't actually say in so many words every state must have racial equality, then every state gets to decide what its policies are, and for the Southerners, that meant Jim Crow. And so that had kept the Southerners within the coalition. And then in 1948, FDR has died 3 years earlier. Harry Truman, his vice president, has risen to become president. Now he's getting ready to run for a term on his own. And Truman, when I talked about earlier the attacks on returning black veterans, Truman, who'd never been particularly attuned to civil rights or sympathetic, was actually very deeply affected by these attacks on black veterans, particularly the attack on a returned sergeant named Isaac Woodard, who's pulled off a bus in South Carolina by a small-town sheriff and has his eyes gouged out. And that really affects Truman, and Truman had begun to actually push forward on civil rights in a way FDR had never dared. But then Truman is looking down the calendar at November 1948, and it's like, well, I think I'm going to forget about my own civil rights initiative. I think I'm going to go back to the FDR playbook of let's placate and appease the Southern segregationists. And that's his intent going into the nominating convention in July 1948. And you get this incredibly complicated set of factions going into the convention. And again, let's forget everything we know about what political conventions are like now. They're very scripted. Nothing is supposed to be left to chance. We know how it all ends up. That's why a lot of us don't watch them, gavel to gavel the way we used to when there was drama and uncertainty. But in 48, it's pretty clear Truman is going to be nominated, but the issue of what the Democrats will do about civil rights is totally up for grabs. And you've got a faction of Southern segregationists who are saying if there's any civil rights language, and even if Harry Truman gets nominated, we're going to walk out of the party and run our own candidate. And I'll talk more about why they wanted to do that later, because that has some real parallels to the coup attempt in 2020. So that's the Southern segregationists. Then you have Harry Truman, who's saying, I don't want an explicit civil rights plank in my platform. I want the same kind of vague, equivocal, fuzzy language FDR always had. And Truman's, point people on the convention floor and in the convention committees are doing everything possible to make sure that that will happen. Then you have A. Philip Randolph, the great civil rights leader I mentioned before, who's been running a campaign urging young black men to refuse to register for the draft and to refuse to serve if they're called up until Harry Truman desegregates the armed forces. And then the last faction is this group of liberals with Humphrey as one of their leaders who are saying, we've got to finally reckon with civil rights. We've got to endorse it. If it drives the Southerners out, so be it. If Harry Truman doesn't want us to do it, so be it. But this is a deeply moral issue within the country. It's the height of hypocrisy during the Cold War to tell decolonizing newly liberated black and brown and yellow former colonies, you should follow the Western example of liberal democracy, even though it includes, apartheid, and not follow, the Marxist-Leninist version, the Soviet version, which was presenting itself very effectively as the political system that is officially opposed to all forms of racial inequality. So Humphrey knew that it was hypocritical for the Democrats to continue to accept forms of Jim Crow in their own country. And there was also a pragmatic element, too, which was that, frankly, most of the Democrats heading into the convention thought Harry Truman was toast. They thought he was going to lose. But you had some big city political bosses, cities with large numbers of black voters, and those bosses, even though they were themselves white ethnics, were concerned that if we don't do something to appeal to black voters, not only is Harry Truman going to lose, but we're going to lose Senate races and House races and city council races and state legislature races. So there's a pragmatic element as well. And all that fortifies this insurgency that Humphrey becomes the most public voice of.
Thank you for painting out that picture, laying out the landscape about the political party. It's such a risk that Humphrey took, in, like you mentioned, when he's a baby, like in political terms at that point, and make that speech. Why do you think he's not spoken about enough? You have devoted a book to his untold story in a way. Do you think one of the reasons why he couldn't become a symbol for the civil rights movement is because he was a white man?
I don't think it's because he's a white man, because I think that in a way that frankly confounds me, Lyndon Johnson has gotten the credit he deserves for what he did as president on behalf of civil rights and also the social safety net programs of the Great Society. And we're able now, thanks to the books of Robert Caro and Robert Dallek and Nick Kotz and Doris Kearns Goodwin and the terrific play and then film adaptation All the Way, which had Bryan Cranston portraying LBJ, we can hold these two thoughts in our head. One thought is that Johnson's escalation in Vietnam was an utter catastrophe for this country and even more so for the people of Vietnam. And yet at the same time, what Johnson accomplished on civil rights and the social safety net was the most incredible legislative program since FDR. And we can hold these two things together and say, here's a complicated, talk about larger than life president. And I just wondered, why doesn't Humphrey similarly get seen in his 360-degree way? Why is the only thing, if people remember him at all, that they seem to remember is Humphrey at his worst? And I certainly, not in the book and not in my own private mind, certainly don't exculpate him for Vietnam. And he, late in his life, said he realized it was the worst mistake he ever made. And he, in getting the nomination in 1968, delivered to him by the Democratic machine, and amid the bloodshed of the police riot at Chicago, that tainted him, and it deserves to taint him, and we should be aware of that too. And yes, he had aspects as a campaigner, particularly his tendency to just run his mouth endlessly and speak way too long, and to be corny, that made him like a prime object of satire and meaner-spirited, what we'd call now snark. Okay, all of that is historically justified. But I kept thinking, what about this guy who was out there on civil rights 15 years before LBJ was? And when he made his speech to the Democratic Convention in 1948, one of the things that makes it so remarkable that he carried the day, that he got, we didn't talk about this explicitly, but he got the Democratic delegates to adopt a platform plank that said, we're going to desegregate the military, we're going to pass anti-lynching law, we're going to have a fair employment practices law at the federal level, and extended also those guarantees not just along the lines of race, but also national origin, religion as well. He got that approved in a convention in which there were 1,500 delegates, of whom 17 were Black. So it's not like there was a block of Black delegates who could vote for it. He had to convince a bunch of white folks to endorse civil rights for non-whites. And that's an amazing, amazing feat. And it was a very, very risky feat. You know, earlier when Humphrey had been the mayor of Minneapolis and had been pushing through a really strong civil rights program there, which was part of what put him on the national political radar, he was nearly assassinated by a neo-Nazi for trying to push that program. So he knew firsthand you could pay for your life for this. And he also knew at the 1948 convention you could lose your political life for doing this. Truman's people at the convention were telling Humphrey in so many words, if you give this pro-civil rights speech, your political career is over. He's being called a pipsqueak. Harry Truman's writing in his diary, calling Humphrey and, his insurgents crackpots. So he understands very well that there are both political and even physical risks to pushing forward on this program.
While we're talking about events and people that led to the civil rights movement that are not spoken about enough, I also want to go for a slight digression, tie it in. In your book, Breaking the Line, you talk about the role football played in ending racial segregation. So we're jumping ahead in this time capsule, going to the year 1967 now. If you can provide a small teaser, what role did football play in ending racial segregation? Why is the year 1967 important?
Well, thanks for asking about Breaking the Line. It's actually much more appropriate than you think, because I just yesterday and Friday was in Canton, Ohio, to see one of the people I wrote about in Breaking the Line enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And the Pro Football Hall of Fame now includes some wonderful exhibits all about what I write about in Breaking the Line, which is the role of Black college football in the freedom movement. And the reason that football was so significant in advancing civil rights is that in the South, football was like religion. College football was much bigger in the 60s than pro football was in the South. And all of the big Southern schools, if people are football fans now, college football fans, you think of the rosters at Alabama or LSU or Georgia, Texas and so on. They're probably 2/3 to 3/4 African-American players. Imagine those teams with 0 Black players, 0 Black coaches. And the reason is that, as I put it in the book, football was so important to the South that it was too important to desegregate, that actually Southern universities under federal court orders had begrudgingly desegregated their student bodies by the early to mid 1960s, but they would not desegregate their football teams in many cases until the 1970s. And so you had these extraordinary football programs at the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities in the South, with all these student athletes who now would go to PWIs like Alabama. Well, at that time, they're going to places like Grambling or Southern University or Florida A&M. And in the book, against the backdrop of 1967, which is a pivotal year in civil rights, because it's a year of incredible breakthroughs like Thurgood Marshall being named the first Black justice of the Supreme Court. and of terrible setbacks like the urban uprisings of the so-called long hot summer, which were really expressions of reaction against not only incidents of police brutality, but in a general sense that it's already been 13 years since Brown versus Board of Ed. It's been 3 years since the Civil Rights Act. How come progress is still so slow, even in the North? So against that kind of mixed backdrop, you have in various ways in the world of HBCU football, these efforts to advance the freedom movement. And a few of the things I write about in the book are at Grambling in northern Louisiana, the head coach, Eddie Robinson, is preparing his quarterback, James Harris, to be able to break the color barrier in the NFL, to become the first Black to be a starting quarterback in the NFL. And why weren't there Black quarterbacks? Because of all the reasons attached to white supremacy. The attitude was a Black isn't smart enough to be quarterback. A Black doesn't have the strength of character to be a quarterback. You can't have a Black person giving orders even in a football huddle to white people. And Eddie Robinson set about to demolish that by preparing James Harris, and that did succeed. And then over at Florida A&M, you had their great coach, Jake Gaither, using the political leverage he'd built up over many years by basically seemingly accommodating himself to the segregation system, never frontally challenging it, but building up all of these political favors, which he then that year cashes in to get the approval to play the first HBCU versus white football game in the Deep South. And then you also have over at South Carolina State, a very politically active head coach, Ori Banks, and his players becoming involved in a series of protests against segregation in Orangeburg, South Carolina, that will end up in what some of your viewers who know civil rights history have heard of called the Orangeburg Massacre, which is when state troopers fire on hundreds of unarmed student protesters and kill several of them. And the protesters and both the injured and the killed included a number of the football players from South Carolina State. So that's all part of this moment of, flux and really sort of a defining year in civil rights in America that I write about in Breaking the Line.
Can you comment on the power of language? You brought it up that the general sentiment when broadcasters used to talk about Black players, athletes, they used to never use the words thinkers, strategists, smart, intelligent. They used to only use the word athletic, implying that they can be physically gifted, but mentally maybe not, right? In recent years, the debate over political correctness has come to the fore, and there's a lot of emphasis on the language we use and the words we use. How important do you think language is? Do you think it's as important as being out there in the trenches, fighting the fight, or do you think it's a supplemental part of it?
I think they have to go together. I think that if you're not going to win a freedom movement or expand rights just by fighting over language, I think language is incredibly important, and all political struggles involve in part struggles of language. I mean, just think in the abortion debate, pro-choice and pro-life, those are both euphemisms.
Yeah.
One is in favor of legalized abortion, one is against legalized abortion, but the partisans choose euphemisms to try to say, hey, look, who could be against choice or who could be against life? And so there's always a battle about language, but you also have to have, you have to hit the bricks. You have to have the boots on the ground. You have to mobilize your people in order to successfully make change. It's not just going to be by fighting over the words that are being used. And I think one of the things I also learned very vividly from writing about Hubert Humphrey and the civil rights movement of the 1940s in Into the Bright Sunshine is that there's a necessary synergy between political action inside and mass mobilization outside, that neither one is sufficient by itself, that you can have a big mass movement and it still may not result in political gains. But also you can have people who are politically astute, and if they don't feel pressed by a mass movement, they're going to be more moderate or even more complacent. And that right after the Democrats endorsed civil rights in 1948, there's this great exchange of letters I've read between Hubert Humphrey and people in A. Philip Randolph's labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and each one is basically complimenting the other. The people from the Black Labor Union are thanking Humphrey for his incredible, bold, and eloquent speech. And Humphrey's writing to the Black Labor Union people and saying, I couldn't have done it without you. Saying I couldn't have done this without you out there outside protesting, without this threat of draft resistance. And the two things were working in different ways for the same end. And that's, I think, one of the real political life lessons from what I wrote about in 1948. And I think the other important lesson of the way Humphrey operated, both in the Democratic Convention, but also as mayor of Minneapolis, is that he was great at putting together coalitions. And he, for instance, Minneapolis was considered the most anti-Semitic city in the country before he became mayor. It was one of the most racist cities in the North. And Humphrey ran amazingly on a civil rights agenda and won. And then he had faced a city council that didn't want to really legislate on civil rights. And what he did was put together what he called a citizens committee, which was a group of basically volunteers to help shape public opinion. And he brought in people from labor and management, Republicans and Democrats, Christians and Jews, whites, blacks, Nisai, Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans, indigenous people, men and women. And a lot of them differed on many other issues. A lot of them were adversaries on other issues, particularly the labor and management people or the Democratic and Republican office holders. But they could agree that they all thought there should be progress on civil rights. And he didn't ask for a loyalty oath from the people in order to be in his coalition. He asked for them to commit to the one thing they did agree on. And I think that's also a really, really, really important lesson about making political progress.
Yeah. Follow-up question for you.
Sure.
You spoke about how mass movements have to have this synergy between the language and the mass mobilization outside. You also spoke about, when we were talking about 1967 and why football suddenly got involved, is because there was this sentiment that's been 13 years since Brown v. Board, and nothing's happened, not much progress has been made. When you study the history of mass movements, there's often this split between ideology, between nonviolence and violence.
Mm-hmm.
In the civil rights movement, it was the ideology that Dr. King took against Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party. In the Indian struggle for independence, it was Mahatma Gandhi versus some revolutionaries who threw bombs in the assembly, like Bhagat Singh. Same idea with Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who had this struggle with nonviolence and violence as well. Having studied so many mass movements in so much depth, what is your take on it? Do you feel nonviolence is more sustainable? Although progress might be slow, it will get you there. Or do you think in order to make progress, you have to get violent, have to get blood on your hands, have to break a few eggs to make that omelet?
I mean, I'd hate to say that that's an imperative, that you can't have progress without violence, because I would say in the United States, as idiom, the feminist movement didn't use violence. The gay rights movement didn't use violence. In fact, the gay rights movement was the subject of incredible violence at many junctures. But it's also true that in thinking of like Dr. King and Malcolm X, now there was really very little violence that the Nation of Islam was held accountable for, ironically, except for the assassination of Malcolm himself after he left the nation. So it's not as if the Nation of Islam was out, engaging in revolutionary violence. But I don't remember the exact quote, but Malcolm X famously said something to the effect of,
Roosters coming home.
Not only that violence was the chickens coming home to roost, which he said specifically about the assassination of John Kennedy. Yeah. But it was that he said, I'm a warning of if you won't make progress when you can make it with someone like Dr. King, you're going to have to deal with someone like me down the road. And it's in your interest, when you have someone who is committed to nonviolence, to work with that person. And I think that the urban uprisings of the 60s cut both ways. They were a real reminder that enough progress hadn't been made. And look, they led to the Kerner Commission being appointed by Lyndon Johnson and issuing its famous report saying that the United States remained two societies that were unequal. But there's also no question that those uprisings alienated a portion of passive white support. And that's also what tends to often happen when you have violence, is that it can serve a warning purpose and make people get to the negotiating table. And it can also end up driving away people you might prefer to have as allies. And that's why it's so, if you think about the George Floyd protest, that's why it's so complicated. I mean, those were morally, utterly justified protests, and they were a huge wake-up call for the country. On the other hand, we also know that because some of them did become violent, that they led to not just a right-wing backlash, but to a certain walking back by kind of middle-of-the-road whites who had been initially very sympathetic to the arguments made by Black Lives Matter and then began to withdraw from it. And I'm not defending their position, but this is just the complicated political reality that's happened over and over again. And even if you think, by the way, about Nelson Mandela, and the fact the African National Congress did have, just like in Northern Ireland with the IRA, there was an armed struggle part and there was a negotiated part. But in both those cases, what eventually got people to the table, whether it was Tony Blair in Northern Ireland or whether it was F.W. de Klerk in South Africa, was realization that if we don't make a negotiated deal while we have someone to make it with, we're looking at catastrophic war.
Yeah.
That we're not going to keep an endless lid on people's aspirations for freedom, and there will be an apocalyptic war that's going to consume us all.
Okay. We've been flirting around the idea of power. Let's talk about it. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson had once said that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. This ultimately became the premise of Robert Carroll's magnum opus, The Power Broker, where he explored the nature of power, the psychology of power. You brought up multiple points where you spoke about Humphrey, who we spoke about the speech he made at the Democratic National Convention much later in his life. He supported the Vietnam War. Now he's only remembered for that, right? He ended up, in a way, compromising on some of his ideas. You spoke about FDR as well, who he made a devil's bargain. Spoke about Truman, who wanted to support civil rights, but when he saw the calendar, he ended up switching slightly. Let's talk about the nature of power. There's a phrase, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You have studied so many important, powerful men in history, presidents, leaders, revolutionaries, politicians. Do you think it's inevitable that when you get into a position of power, it will end up staining your soul, tainting you, make you compromise on your integrity? Or do you think it's just the extra scrutiny that comes with positions of power that end up amplifying your flaws, but it's not power itself that changes you?
I believe that absolute power will absolutely corrupt, but I think that power is just a tool and it can be used for good or ill, not dictatorial absolute power, but to gain political power or social power. It's what you do with it. And I don't think that it inevitably leads to corruption at all. And I think actually one of the failures of many parts of the political left, particularly in the US, or maybe it's just I'm so much more familiar with the US, is the idea that there's something immoral about having power and that the only kind of morally defensible stance is to be powerless or to be oppressed or to be the underdog. And I don't buy that for 1 second. And I think people who are genuinely powerless don't think that there's anything moral about being powerless. And I think that part of what makes political leadership or religious leadership or leadership in the business sector of society or the sporting world or anywhere else important is that the right people can use that power in the right ways. And it's just a fantasy to think that you can be without power, only on the outside, appealing for people who have, despicable or at the least mistaken political values and stances that, that if you protest enough or call them out enough on social media, that the heavens are going to part and they'll all see the error of their ways and change. That's just not the way it works. And I think that Humphrey in 48, the people he worked with the convention, and Johnson as president were good examples, and FDR with all of his flaws, his shortcomings on civil rights, but with the rest of his agenda, were great examples of using political power, using political acumen in order to get a positive result for a larger society. And I think we need to keep that in mind and not think that we should back away from the idea of being in power. Look, there are people who are powerless who do ignoble things also. I don't think, human nature is made better or worse by being in power or not in power. Again, as I said at the outset, it's a tool. What do you do with that tool? And it's a really great tool if you can use it for the right ends.
Is there a specific trait that stands out to you for like these leaders that you mentioned, that it takes a special type of man to get power, but use it in the right sense and not get corrupted by it?
That's absolutely true. But look, when you're talking about having political power, it's on a very big canvas.
Yeah.
But what makes someone a good parent or a bad parent?
Mm-hmm.
What makes someone a good spouse or a bad spouse? What makes someone a good teacher or a bad teacher?
Manager, bosses. Yeah.
Yeah, a good minister or a bad minister. All those on somewhat smaller canvases are positions of power. And it's power in conversation with human nature and with the values that all of us develop over our lifetime. It's not like we're born intrinsically good or bad. There's a great phrase I remember from a child development book that talked about, parenting a child is a form of civilizing the savage, because your child is born with no particular value system, is born wanting to eat and sleep and defecate and urinate and that, and cry when it needs something. And that's about it. Everything else that your child absorbs on the way to adulthood is going to come from outer influences and a process of learning. Mm-hmm. And so you can be, a parent who raises a thoughtful and compassionate and socially conscious kid, or you can be a parent who raises a child to be violent and defensive and repressed and all kinds of negative things.
Who do you think was one leader that had the most impact in history, good or bad? Who do you think left such a mark that they changed the course of human history forever?
Wow. What forever is a very difficult one. But I think if you look over the long arc of history, I think you'd have to look at historical religious figures, frankly. You'd have to say, Jesus, Moses, Muhammad.
Yeah.
Because there are really entire civilizations that emerge from them. Mm-hmm. And they're not the only examples, but we're talking about figures from millennia ago whose impact is still profound and unfortunately subject to a lot of interpretation or misinterpretation. But those would be absolutely my choices. And then, there's a long gap between them and someone like Gutenberg for inventing the printing press and what it meant to have a society of mass literacy, or, someone from ancient Greece for the spread of what would become the Enlightenment, or in a horrible way, someone like Hitler.
Yeah. Such singular events that had such a significant impact on history. I'll try to tie this into the next question. I feel it's related to it. In your book, Letters to a Young Journalist, you say that journalism is about channeling emotions, not turning them off. And on some rare and extraordinary occasions, it is about tearing down the barrier, what theater people call the fourth wall, separating us from the people and events that we are reporting. if you can't be a person, then you'll ultimately be less of a journalist. You have written a book or multiple books about Jewish history as a member of the Jewish community yourself. And now you've written a couple of books about the civil rights movement as well. Clearly not as an African American. Have you noticed a difference in the way that you had to approach these stories, in the sense that, and you mentioned this in letters to a young journalist as well, that you want to get emotionally involved in Jewish history, but you want to maintain a distance, that you stay fair, which is the ethic that you talk about. And was that different from the approach that you had to take when you're researching a story about civil rights movement, where possibly your approach to it can be viewed as antagonistic as well, because it's the classic white savior trope, right?
That's a really great question. I think that from the outside, it probably looks like if I write a book about American Jewry, I'm writing it as an insider. But actually, there are tribes within tribes within tribes. And when I started writing Jew versus Jew, I actually felt very unprepared for that task, because I was very moderately observant in my own religious life. I had never, studied, I couldn't read Hebrew. I'd never studied the Talmud. There are all kinds of ways in which I felt woefully inadequate in terms of having the theological knowledge to be able to write intelligently about the American Jewish experience. And while I felt, because I've always been kind of oriented towards history, on firmer ground in the secular historical aspects of the American Jewish experience, that was still a book that was a big leap for me. And if anything, I think because it was loosely speaking my own community, I felt more like I was going to be a lot more scrutinized if I got anything wrong, and it would be really unforgivable if I got it wrong. Whereas, of course, when I wrote Upon This Rock, my book about a year in the life of a black church, I absolutely wanted to get everything right to show that the white guy could actually learn it and get it right. But also, when I was in settings in and around church doing the research, people didn't expect me to know things. I think my well-intentioned ignorance was more acceptable, because I was this white Jewish, and at that point not religiously observant guy. So I was like a triple outsider. And I think they had, there's a great Yiddish word, Rachmanis. It means having pity. So they had Rachmanis on me. And I think with Jew versus Jew, actually, I was much more in a constant state of shame and embarrassment about all that I didn't know. And it was a gigantic undertaking for me to catch up to it. In terms of being, critical, it was a book that by nature had a lot of critical elements, because I was writing a book about the conflicts within American Jewry, but I also wasn't trying to argue a point of which side in those conflicts was right. That was a book in which I was trying to, because there have been other books that took a more opinionated position, like either the answer is to embrace religion or the answer is to reject religion, and one or the other as an absolute is the way to have a meaningful Jewish life in America. And I wasn't interested in that argument. I was interested in rubbing against each other the different ideas of what it is to be a good Jewish person, what it is to be, a good Jewish congregation or community, and letting that tension exist in the reader's head. And, even in a book like Breaking the Line, look, I think that it's a story of some real heroes, particularly James Harris, the quarterback at Grambling, an amazing figure in American civil rights history for what he accomplished. But you can't just do an airbrush portrait of anybody. And so, for instance, the two head football coaches in that book, Eddie Robinson at Grambling and Jake Gaither at Florida A&M, were tormented by what their role could or couldn't be in civil rights. And I had to be honest about that. They were very divided within themselves. Of course, these were two black men who had master's degrees at a time when maybe 1 or 2% of black Americans had a master's. They were highly educated men. They were dignified and principled and great husbands and fathers. And yet, so they're role models, walking examples of black equality to any white person. And yet because they worked for universities that were controlled by segregationist state governments, they felt they could never take a stand. They were often advising their student athletes, don't protest, don't get involved. Now, some of that was a fear that if you do that, you might get shot down, not an idle fear, or get lynched, not an idle fear. But some of it was that they worried about, I could get, as head coach, fired. The state, the governor, the Board of Regents, they could fire me with the snap of the fingers. And so they had been reluctant for a long time to take a stand. And they were criticized within their own universities by activist students and activist faculty members for not taking a stand. I mean, James Harris recalled to me, coming back, from practice, and Eddie Robinson, the head coach, would give these great patriotic orations to the team, and he certainly felt them. And then Harris and his teammates were watching, the attack, had grown up watching Bull Connor turn the water hoses and dogs on the children marching in Birmingham, and countless examples of that. And James Harris said someday he would come home to the dorm and just shake his head and say, Coach Rob sure waves that flag. He was frustrated that this man he admired so much seemed to have a blinkered view of what America was about. Now, ultimately, in their ways, Harris and Gaither, I think, found a way to contribute to the freedom movement. But I couldn't say that just because I'm a white guy writing about Black life, I should aggrandize them falsely. I should ignore I can sympathize as a historian with the incredible difficulty of their position, but I don't come to make excuses for it or to pretend it wasn't there, because there are other coaches, like someone I mentioned earlier, Ori Banks at South Carolina State, who was a member of the NAACP, who, when his student athletes came to him and said, should we protest? He basically said, in almost so many words, you have to be on the right side of history. So there was another way for a football coach at an HBCU to be. And similarly, in writing about Humphrey, I wanted this book to put him back on the historical map in terms of the incredible efforts he made in civil rights. But I was also very conscious throughout my research of this can't be hagiography. It can't be a nomination for sainthood. And I have to always look for where the flaws are. I have to always look for where the feet of clay are, so that it's intellectually honest. And that's why, even though this book is primarily about his role and his allies and his adversaries in the civil rights movement of the 40s, I start out the book with him late in his life with his reputation in tatters. And I give all the reasons why, because I think a reader needed to know that there was a whole other part of his public life that I have to own up to honestly as an author and a biographer. And if you don't do that, then none of lifting up the great work he did is believable at the end of the day.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting, the dynamic, the tensions that you describe when you were researching all these stories and the ideas that you're exploring and how you want to stay fair to each and every idea. A lot of tips that young journalists, young writers, young people can take in general. While we are in this realm, I have to get a recommendation out of you.
Okay.
You have said in a previous interview that fiction gets to the truths of human nature, gets to them better than nonfiction. What are some fiction books that you think every young person should read?
Well, I don't know if I would say young person, but I remember a few years ago, Facebook was asking everyone who wanted to join in this, or maybe it was one of my Facebook friends, nominate your 5 favorite nonfiction books and your 5 favorite fiction books. So I'll go with some of my favorites. I think the greatest American novel of my lifetime is Continental Drift by Russell Banks, which is an amazing epic about the collision of lives between a blue-collar plumber who leaves New Hampshire because he feels like his life is going nowhere and goes to South Florida thinking that's where he'll make a new start, and a woman who leaves Haiti with her nephew because they've run afoul of the Duvalier dictatorship and have to come to Florida on a smuggler's boat, and the way those two lives collide. And it's just an extraordinary work of writing, but also of moral conception. So that is absolutely high up on my list. I love the South African novelist Andre Brink, who was an Afrikaner who really broke in an incredibly courageous way with his tribe of Afrikaners to become a dissident writer whose work was often banned. And there are two books of his that I kind of rate almost equally that I'll mention. One is called A Dry White Season, which was actually made into quite a good film with Donald Sutherland in it. And it's about an Afrikaner school teacher who he's just going along to get along. He thinks society is going pretty well under apartheid. And then the janitor, the black man who's a janitor at his school, his son vanishes into detention during a state of emergency and is killed. And it's what happens when the white teacher gets drawn into investigating the disappearance and sees what his society is all about. So that, and there's another one also much more purely psychological, less sort of plotted book than A Dry White Season called Rumors of Rain, but it also is very much about how an unequal system, whether it's apartheid in South Africa or Jim Crow in the US, it destroys the people who think they're benefiting from it too. It morally makes them monstrous. And that's another favorite of mine. The novelist Jessamine Ward, her book Sing Unburied Sing, which is very much about race and incarceration and the legacy of both in the Deep South. That's a wonderful work of fiction. So those are some of the ones that I had on the list. I also...
What about the nonfiction ones?
Well, I just had one other fiction writer. I love the novelist Alice McDermott, also just a really beautiful stylist and someone who writes very, very meaningfully about mostly Irish Catholic mid-20th century life in the U.S. and is really attuned to the emotional lives of her characters. And then the other one, and then I'll go to nonfiction, Oscar Uelos has a bunch of fantastic novels. The one a lot of people probably would know is The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love. But my favorite of his, and I think it's the best novel about religion I've ever read, is called Mr. Ives' Christmas. And he basically takes a version of the Job story out of the Hebrew Bible and turns it into the life of a middle-class Cuban-American couple in New York in the early 60s whose son is killed in a meaningless drive-by shooting. And it's about what unmerited suffering means and the test of faith that it puts people through. So those were, I think, my fiction choices. And then for nonfiction, to me, the totemic book of narrative nonfiction, and it was the book that was a great inspiration to my whole generation of narrative nonfiction authors, is Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas, which takes three families and follows them through the crisis in Boston over a plan to racially balance schools by mandatory busing, which actually, because most prosperous whites had left Boston already, ended up becoming a matter of pitting, working class and working poor whites against working class and working poor blacks. And the book follows a black family whose child is going to be bused, a white Irish family whose family is resisting the busing, and an upper middle class white couple who are kind of part of the social engineers who came up with this whole idea. And it's just an extraordinary, extraordinary book. So that's on Olympus for my generation of narrative nonfiction writers.
Such a great list, so many great books to read. As we are winding down, I have one final big question for you, and then we move into our final few questions. It's a cheeky question, so you're free to skip it if you like. You have expressed a desire to write a book about jazz history.
Yes. You
have often said that jazz has evolved through a series of invasions from 1900s to 1970s. Is it too much to ask you to provide a small teaser into the type of ideas that you're looking to explore in that book?
I would be happy to do it if I already had a contract, but I still have to decide. I have sort of two different jazz history ideas vying for my brain right now. And until I decide which one and then write a book proposal and then get a contract, I'm going to keep it on the down low, or as the black idiom always advises, don't put your business out in the street.
I get it. It was a cheeky question.
No, it's not cheeky at all. It's a totally legit question.
But I'm looking forward to those books as someone who's very interested in jazz history. I would love to see those books.
Okay, call me in a year. I should know by then.
I'll follow up with you. I'll drop you an email. Before we move into final questions, I would love it if you can interpret what masterpiece I've built with the Lego. What do you think this is?
It looks like maybe a bit of a skyscraper, or else is that like a Parthenon? Is that a set of Greek columns?
Open to interpretation.
I don't know. This looks sort of like the Citicorp Center in Manhattan.
Okay.
And this makes me think, although what this open space is there, I'm not so sure, but that immediately makes me think of Doric columns.
Doric columns, yeah. Maybe it is.
So this is your version of the Rorschach test, right? So now we'll find out what my inner self really is.
Yeah, so maybe it's like Manhattan looking at like the ancient times and the Parthenon. Who knows? It's like
well, there's no question that the New World was always looking to antiquity. You know, I teach at Columbia, and you look at the Columbia campus, and it's built absolutely mindful of trying to model itself on Greece and Rome.
Yeah.
It's very, very, very explicit. You know, when you go to Princeton, the campus, they're modeling that, you know, with the Gothic architecture on Oxford and Cambridge. Yeah. So there's such a conversation of influence and modeling in architectural decision making.
Those are some of my favorite buildings in Columbia as well. The Butler Library, the Low Building, and then the area where you can see both of them.
Yes, I want to tell your listeners, if you visit Manhattan, the Columbia campus is beautiful. You'll never think you're right in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
You walk into the main part of the campus at 116th Street, and you feel like in that central campus area, you could be, you know, at, I don't know, the University of Michigan or any, you know, school with a big expansive campus rather than right in the middle of Gotham City.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's never spoken about enough as one of the places to visit in New York because there's so much to visit.
Right.
But I think it's as close to religious or spiritual experience to walk towards Butler Library and see all those names and the columns. It is a special feeling for me, and I hope it's for other people as well. Let's move into some of our final questions. What are some, we've already spoken about books, so let's keep book aside. Movies and role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
Well, that's a great question. I'd say as a writer, and this is also true of my generation of writers, we were like high school and college students during that period of the 1970s, of the heyday of indie movie making.
Yeah.
And so films, you know, The Godfather and Chinatown and Coming Home and Raging Bull, all those, you know, Scorsese and Hal Ashby and Coppola films, I think were really influential on us as writers because it taught us certain structural devices that film uses, like cutaways, dissolves, flashback sections. So even though I'm actually, in terms of my artistic diet, my two great love affairs are with live music, especially jazz, and live theater. You know, I like the movies, but if I, you know, had to live without movies or without theater, it would be a simple choice. But structurally, I got a lot out of watching those films. And, you know, and to this day, some of my most favorite films, like, you know, Godfather Part 2, definitely come from that era. And I've also been tremendously affected over my whole life by theater. My parents, particularly my mom, were very big theater goers. The great mentor of my life, Mr. Robert W. Stevens of Highland Park High School, who was my journalism teacher, but really was primarily a theater teacher, and ran this incredible drama program in our high school where we did Shakespeare plays and Moliere and Tennessee Williams. So through my family and through Mr. Stevens, I became an ardent theater goer from a really early age and remain so to this day. So I would say that I'm also, as a writer, and just as in terms of my aesthetic and my emotive life, affected really intensely by theater. And, I'll anticipate your next question. So for me, Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night is kind of the masterwork of theater. And Tennessee Williams' work, August Wilson's work, particularly, it's so hard, this 10-play century cycle, but The Piano Lesson is a real favorite of mine. Joe Turner's Come and Gone. So a lot of that really affected me. And as a writer, just like I learned these ideas of cutaway and flashback and dissolve and so forth from watching film, I think theater taught me an awful lot about how you use dialogue and about pacing action.
Yeah.
And I should add that in my reporting career, one of the luckiest things that ever happened to me is I spent 3 years in the early 1980s covering theater for the New York Times. So I wasn't a critic. I covered the industry as a business, and I also wrote feature stories about the creative artists. But I got to see, I once tallied it up, I saw 100 plays in 3 years. And that was a great way to learn how to be a writer. And because of what I was saying before, pacing, dialogue, stage action, the importance of a prop, all those things really became part of my skill set ultimately in the way I write books.
Some great takeaways that you can take from theater and film into writing itself. I hope you're starting to feel the heat. I'm going to ramp up the difficulty of the questions as we're winding down. These are going to be the last 4 questions.
Okay.
I'm going to indulge you in a thought experiment now. You've often said that journalism is a profession in change. It's never fixed. What do you think the future of journalism will look like? What do you think journalism, news, media will look like 50 years from now?
Well, it's getting more and more blasted apart and fragmented because the technology allows it. As my wife, who studied innovation studies in grad school, always reminds me, there's this constant wheel turning that involves actual innovation in the sense of inventing new things, business models, in other words, where's the revenue coming from, and where's the audience for something. And those things are constantly interdependent. And so because the technologies continue to allow for a greater profusion of how journalism, loosely speaking, is put out there, it'll be more and more and more expansive. I think that also means it gets more and more and more niched because everyone can go right to the thing that they think they want, which is a big change from something we talked about much earlier, which was having major news organizations that would pretty much tell their viewers or readers, trust us, we think this is important, and so you should think it's important because it's on our front page or it's at the top of the evening newscast. So we'll continue to have people, instead, as I sometimes say, instead of going to the department store, going to a whole series of boutiques and choosing what they want out of the boutiques. I think the most positive thing in American journalism that's happening is there's been a real explosion of nonprofit news organizations, basically online-only newspapers that have come in to cities or entire states in which, for a variety of economic reasons, the existing mid-sized and small-sized newspapers have collapsed. Either they've gone out of business or they're so thin that they're almost, worthless for their readers.
Yeah.
And what's fantastic is there's foundation money and an entrepreneurial spirit that has started publications. Some of them are geographical, like the Texas Tribune or the Baltimore Banner. Others of them are oriented towards types of reporting, like the Marshall Project, writing about the criminal justice and injustice system, or ProPublica, doing investigative reporting. And I think that's the kind of growing edge of legit journalism. The problem of disinformation and pseudo-journalism is going to get worse and worse and worse. And then we also have the fairly frightening spectacle of what AI is going to mean to journalism. And it is going to affect so many things, but just in the journalistic world, what does it mean in terms of more sophisticated deep fakes? What does it mean in terms of seeming to be able to do jobs so you can fire human beings? I mean, the strike going on with the writers in Hollywood right now and the actors, those strikes are very much underlined by the threat of AI taking away acting and writing jobs. And I think that every journalist has a big stake in the settlement of the writers and actors strikes in Hollywood right now, because they may just be the proverbial canaries in the coal mine who are facing AI taking over their jobs earlier than we in journalism will. But it's heading in our direction too.
You once asked your mother, do you ever wish that you were not alive? To which she said the beautiful words, not as long as there's one more great book to read, one more great play to see.
Right.
What is your current relationship with death, having explored it and processed it so deeply for your book, Who She Was, where you explored the loss of your mother? What is your relationship with death now? Are you afraid of it? Are you at peace with it?
Mm-hmm.
Are you somewhere in the middle?
Right. Well, just to also contextualize that poignant thing my mom said, she died of cancer when she was 50 years old. And the scene in which that happens is when she was in the final couple of months of her life, and we had gone, she and my dad and I, up to New Hampshire to visit my brother at a camp where he was a counselor.
Yeah.
And my mother had forgotten to bring her painkillers with her. And and she was just in agony from her bones were deteriorating from the advances of her cancer. It's just horrible. And this was before cell phones and email. You couldn't just sort of text your doctor and say, oh, I forgot, my painkillers. Can you call a prescription to Concord, New Hampshire for me?
Yeah.
And so my father had gone into a pharmacy to kind of beg them to fill a prescription and trying to track down my mother's oncologist. And as she was in the car, whimpering with pain, that's when I asked her that. And her answer was amazing. What a life force. So I'm almost 68. So this is definitely more front of mind, mortality. I feel vigorous and healthy. And so in that respect, my own demise feels not so proximate. And I had two different experiences with my parents. My mom was dead at 50. My father lived till 89 and had his marbles right until the very last day. So I think I look forward to some more decades, but I also feel like I've done the things I wanted to do. I'm not going to stop working, but I've written books about what matters to me, and I've written books even if the commercial publishing system was telling me I should be doing something else or doing it a different way. And in my teaching life at Columbia, the most important part of that has been a book writing class that I've taught for 33 years, and I always said I wanted to get 100 books to come out of that class, and that count is now 108. So I'm still going to teach it for 2 more years, but in both of these ways, I feel like I've done my life's work. I hope there'll be more of it, but if a truck ran me down as I leave the studio today, I don't feel that I would have left an incomplete body of work. And I think like a lot of people, my only hope, even though I'm a lifelong recreational athlete, and I'd hate to think of being physically immobilized or diminished, but my greatest fear, having seen an uncle of mine and my very beloved stepmother both, afflicted with Alzheimer's, would be to be physically alive and mentally deteriorating. That's the thing I fear the most.
I want to touch upon what you mentioned about having done a lot of work that you're already proud of. Nicholas Lehman had once said that it often seems to me that at any given moment, 99% of the journalists are covering 1% of what's happening in the world. You have often strived to cover beyond that 1%, the remaining 99%. What is that one story, book, lecture, class that you're most proud of? An unfair question.
Oh boy, that is... Well, in terms of a class, there are 2 semesters when I taught that I felt really called on everything that I had within me as a professor. One was the fall of September 11th. It it was only 2 weeks into the semester at Columbia. A lot of my students had never even been journalists before.
Yeah.
They were literally all over the city covering a primary election. One of them thought her husband had been killed. He was working a temp job at Ground Zero, as what we now call Ground Zero. And to try to hold that class together and give everyone solace and also commitment, to go ahead and to write these really important stories. I mean, I remember one thing I was proud of pedagogically is we had class. It was the next class we had after the day of the attack. I brought in 2 pieces of writing to read to my students, to read aloud to them. One was an essay, a beautiful essay about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington that a writer named Michael Norman, who was a war veteran himself, had written. Mm-hmm. And it's about grief. And the other was an article that a student of mine from many years earlier had written for a class of mine for the book writing class. And it was a narrative during the first Gulf War about an elementary school basketball game taking place against the backdrop of war. And I just had my students sit there and I just read them those 2 stories as a way of sort of saying, both journalists sometimes have to work amid the imponderable and the catastrophic, but our writing is our way of making sense of it or reckoning with it.
Yeah.
So that was probably the single, and I mean, that moment, but that whole semester was tremendously important to me. And, in terms of book writing, it's hard because it's like choosing between your different children. I have a different point of contact emotionally and craft-wise with each of my books. And I couldn't single one out above the others for any craft reason. I guess the book I wrote about my mother, Who She Was, is different from the rest because of how personal it is. And even though it's largely a biography of her as a young woman long before I was born, it's about her coming of age. It was important to me 30 years after her death, coming to terms with her death and coming to terms with what I felt was shameful inability to grieve for much of that time.
Do you end up, I'm sorry, just a follow-up from that, do you end up leaving a part of you inside all your books to an extent that if you now pick up one of your older copies, you can immediately tell the mental state you were in at that point when you were writing it?
Absolutely. That's a really astute question. You have to channel that through your craft. You don't just write out of being emo, but there is an emotional aspect. And every book is subliminally autobiographical. Every book anybody writes has some autobiographical element. Either that or they're not doing their job right. If it's just something that you do because it's work for hire, well, that's fine. People need to do things to make a living, and all work has dignity, I've always felt. But with the type of books that I write, that my students write, that my friends in publishing write, even if we don't use the first person pronoun, we're in there. It comes from, why did this idea engage you? Why did you want to spend 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 years on this subject rather than any other? So there's always a personal piece in there.
What would you like your legacy to be?
Well, I think that the legacy is, in one part, everything my students have done.
Yeah.
And the books they'll write, and some of them have become teachers, and the way I learned to teach from my teachers. I hope the students of mine who've become professors or teachers learn some of that skill from me. And I think with my children that they have great values. They're both oriented towards writers, my son in a more scholarly, historical way, my daughter in a more playwriting, screenwriting way. And it delights me that in a way that I did nothing overtly to try to push them into, but that they've chosen to do this kind of work. And it's really a joy to share conversations about writing and books, and as well as films and theater and so forth with them.
Final question. What do you think is the meaning of life, Sam Freedman?
Well, I can tell you what the most meaningful thing in my life was, which was my wife, Christiana Blomquist Freedman, who I met in college, and we didn't get together then. And it took 30 years before we found each other again. And having that kind of deep love and profound companionship with one's life partner is the epitome of lived life.
Yeah, the meaning of life is in love. Love is always the answer. Professor, thank you so much. If people want to connect with you, get one of your books, where can they do so?
The books are available on the main online sites. They're, of course, Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but I also want to recommend a wonderful online independent book selling site called bookshop.org. So one word, bookshop.org. And look for me on Facebook. The evil people who use Twitter or run it now a few months ago hacked and stole my Twitter account, and I could not get back on. And after what Elon Musk has done, I wouldn't want to be anyway. So there's still a fake account of mine out there. Pay no attention to it. But you can find me on Facebook, and you can email me at Columbia at sgf1@columbia.edu. And I love getting email from readers or people who are interested in journalism or culture, and try to answer any of them that look like they weren't organized by a political or an ideological campaign.
Perfect. That's the place to find you. Professor, thank you so much. It was an honor talking to you.
Well, it's an honor. And Shahaj, what an amazing interview. I mean, you really do your work extraordinarily well.